Hello, everyone. Welcome to this podcast. Today, I'm in the company of Romeck Van Zeijl.
Van Zeijl.
Van Zeijl, apologies. Romeck is a colleague, is a psychotherapist, is also a group work circling aficionado, like myself. We share passion for a variety of things, including Socratic dialogos. Today, we've agreed to discuss the topic of rules made by societies, nations, groups of people, families. And I feel that because we mostly know each other through interaction in groups, self-development groups of some sort, I feel that today's discussion might be informed by our experience of rules made by groups. So we will actually explore this topic in the format of Socratic dialogos, where one person makes a proposal, might be virtuous, what might be a virtue about the topic in question, rules, and the other person helps that person exploring that. And maybe you can say a bit more about that process if you want in a second. But the last thing I want to say before passing it over to you, Romeck, is why was I fascinated? I have been fascinated by the topic of rules that people make, because I feel like I've always been particularly sensitive. Perhaps I feel like I've been more sensitive than the average person about rules the group of people made. So it was strong for me, my awareness of rules. I'm the sort of person that enters a room and is particularly sensitive of what the rules might be. Of course, it's a hunch. I cannot be 100% sure. So this can give me an insight on a situation which helped me with my therapy work, but can also be a disadvantage. And in my teenage years and my early 20s, where I had a low self-esteem at that point of my life, it was more like a disadvantage. And when at the age of 22, I left Italy. I moved to London, where I felt that rules seemed much more fluid, much wider, and the London culture, I should say, because I feel like it feels different than the rest of the nation where London is. The tolerance, London's tolerance is very well known. Whatever the culture of London is, and I think it's fluid and wide and varied, it doesn't feel so dominant. Whereas in many other countries where I went visiting, including my own country, Italy, I felt that the culture was really dominant. And I felt I had to conform, and I didn't want to, or I was struggling to. The last thing I'm going to say is that even when I got to a very privileged place of becoming a therapist and running groups, I say privileged because then I'm in the company of people that, theoretically have done a lot of self-development work and would be very open-minded. Yeah, more open-minded than the average person. Still, I feel the groups make rules. And that's not negative. Rules can protect private property, can protect our rights. Rules are inevitable to narrow the scope of human interactions and protect some rights. But in my view, they would need to be acknowledged in order to create a safe environment. So that's my introduction, and thank you for your patience, Romeck.
No, I didn't need patience to stay with you. Maybe I can just add a little context for myself. I don't only work as a psychotherapist. I've also been working as a leadership coach and organizational development. So the topic of rules turns up very often, very explicitly and implicitly in my work. And just to come back to you, so that's how the topic is alive for me. And to come back to you, what hearing you say is like I hear an echo of culture, the rules of a culture, or the cultural rules can almost be synonymous with like social control. What I'm also hearing strongly in your words is advocacy of making rules explicit and transparent and not keeping them hidden. And I have an impulse before we explicitly start to get into the dialogos format to ask you a question, if I may. Maybe something like, what's the best thing about rules? And what's the worst thing about non-explicit rules for you?
So what comes up, I need to repeat myself. The best thing about rules would be, well, what comes up is some of the most advanced constitutions. The American Constitution, I feel a very, very good one. The Declaration of Human Rights. I'm sure I'm getting this wrong. By Theodore Roosevelt. I think him and his wife. It sets out some very fundamental statements about what constitutes human rights. So, and I mean, like protecting private property would be, I mean, we can explore the social constraints of people remaining stuck in their working poor class. Yeah. But nevertheless, I value the opportunity of having something that protects a property for which I work hard for half of my life.
Yeah, what I'm also hearing strongly is something about rules protect. Rules create a freedom too, like when we agree about our human rights. So rules have something to do with our rights. So they're not just constraining, but they're also enabling. That's what I'm hearing.
You heard me very well. I was just thinking that I have not yet answered the second part of your question.
What's the worst thing about non-explicit rules?
Well, if a rule is not made explicit, then either people would conform to them without realizing. For instance, groups, you and I had a conversation that often groups can split about groups that appreciate honesty and groups that appreciate the opposite of honesty, full acceptance, no matter what, unconditional love.
Is that an opposite of honesty to you?
It is not really, but when it comes to groups, to me, it feels like groups seem to split in these two polarities. Groups that feel if we are honest with each other, then that's going to be the main virtue, being honest. But there are people that struggle with honesty, then say, well, accept me no matter what.
I get it. Yeah. So what I'm hearing and appreciating is already around the theme of rules. What's emergent is that we're actually talking about the polarity, it seems. And you mentioned the word polarity, I think, a couple of times. Like there's a polarity between honesty and what I heard is something like harmony and acceptance and comfort, belonging. And the needle can go both ways. Honesty without perhaps empathy and paying attention to each other's well-being could be a brutal mud-flinging contest, and being harmonious and accepting each other and doing that without honesty might turn into a sort of rather boring and inauthentic social muddle.
Absolutely. So to answer your question is, if one, also in the West, we are in a historically profoundly Christian, and I've been living in London for half of my life. And I think most British people would agree with me that it's one of the least religious countries in the world, one of the most secular countries in the world, if not the most secular, I dare say. I find that the culture of the UK, I dare say, is massively influenced by Christianity. So even those that profess themselves as atheists, there is something about, protecting vulnerable people. So what I would say is, if you are in an environment where everybody is trying to protect vulnerable people, which is the environment of total acceptance, and you could say that politically that would be incarnated by the left. We stand with the diverse people, we stand with minority, we stand with people who have disabilities, we stand with those who struggle. But if you are in a group that does that, it's very easy not to acknowledge that we are all trying not to upset each other.
What I find very interesting about where you're going with this, but I have to warn you, if I say more, then I'm not yet adhering really to the dialogos format that we were talking about. But yet somehow inevitably in how you are approaching it, for me, there are strong echoes of what we talked about before, these sort of developmental stages of societies and individuals that a society or a culture or a group can move through, where perhaps there's a stage where what they describe in spiral dynamics as the blue stage, where adhering to the rules is more important than anything else. The rules are dictated from above, and there's even a belief that perhaps God dictated those rules, or some absolute authority. And then at the stage that evolves out of that, people start to question the rules and subject the rules more to the value of efficiency and data and research and what kind of outcomes and so on. And then I'm just like really flying through these short descriptions of the stages. And then there's the stage of the green mean, which you've heard about, where the shared values, often implicit shared values, because we sort of seem to agree that, yes, of course, empathy is important and compassion is important and equality is important and diversity is important. We don't need to talk about it. Obviously, that's important. Tolerance is important. I've spent a lot of time in groups where that was almost like the implicit agreement, and that we respect each other's views, that diversity is important, all the things we just said. And yet there can be like a hidden set of rules, like, for instance, the rules that tolerance is everything. You must not be intolerant. And you get this whole paradoxical thing of, if someone starts to act in a less than tolerant way, then people get extremely emotionally angry about it.
Yes.
I suspect you've experienced things like that.
If you don't mind me boxing things up so that we also respect who's listening, may I offer it to you that what you're saying could fit into the other polarity of honest, total acceptance, where the other polarity that I offered was honesty.
Yes, I heard you. Yeah, the polarity between total acceptance and total honesty.
Yes, and with total honesty total honesty cannot be tolerant. But I feel like we live in a society where both of these polarities are very strong. So I feel abused by what you said. I feel traumatized by what you said. I feel unsafe around you because you said that. It takes so little to people these days, particularly on social media, to make such statement of entering the victim mode and accusing somebody of being a persecutor.
Even people who are extremely good at persecuting themselves are even better at accusing others of being the persecutor, like Donald Trump. But yeah, we're on the same page, I feel, where in this sort of where the hidden rule is acceptance, empathy, all those other things. And it's like in our conversation, what's emerging is kind of a realization that can never work, to go all the way into that polarity, because you inevitably end up in some kind of inauthentic soup where if you believe I've broken the rule of total acceptance, you will start accusing me of traumatizing you or disrespecting you, which then leads to all kinds of complicated entanglements.
Yes, and in a way, it's like accusing me of total honesty, because I suppose prejudice could be going as total. You could accuse me of having a prejudice against you because I've been honest, but that could simply me being honest, saying how I feel around you. You could read into that the fact that I'm judging you because of your being a minority. Do you see where I'm going? But at the same time, the person who feels like a victim then is choosing the rule of total honesty by saying, I feel you traumatize me with what you...
Yeah, I'm listening to your words and remembering all kinds of echoes of situations that I've experienced. And I feel compelled to kind of slow down a bit and talk a little bit about forms of honesty and definitions of honesty. And that, in a way, either total honesty as the good thing or as the bad thing, or it's kind of a bit of a black and white frame of mind, whereas when we go deeper into this, we have to deal with more complexity. Now, there's more complexity to this. Total honesty isn't a simple thing, because total honesty can be said in a way that I truly own my part in it, and I'm actually sharing my experience. Or total honesty, between inverted commas, can mean, in some circles, telling you that I think you're an asshole and claiming that I'm just being honest. Whereas that's
Sharing
not,
my feelings.
yeah, I'm just sharing my feelings. I think you're an asshole. Well, that's not sharing feelings. So let's say that's a twisted form of honesty, between inverted commas, attacks the other person. So it's attacking, posing as honesty.
Prior to the video, we agreed to explore what a virtue related to this topic would be. So I was gonna propose that with the topic of rules making and rules following, acknowledging whatever the rules are is a virtuous thing to do, just as a proposal, not because I am convinced this is absolutely correct, but I'm also a bit hesitant because I'm curious what you think. That maybe more context needs to be set in terms of groups that we've been part of. I'm not too sure it would be so obvious to whoever is listening now. The point about acknowledging rules and making that obvious is virtuous. I'm not sure whether it would be clear enough why.
I was also kind of thinking about, is this still interesting to our listeners? Is this alive enough for our listeners, and wanting it to be, and maybe wanting to get a clearer sense of what matters deeply to you about this. And that's kind of like an invitation from me to you to go into a sort of proposal and just see where it gets you. And like in the dialogos mode, I will not argue with you, or I will, my role is to amplify and what you are saying for you, and educe, like draw out what matters most to you. And then we'll see where that gets us. How does that sound?
The sounds of it sounds great. I'm not sure what. Often we sort of agree on what the virtue of discussion would be. What would be the topic of discussion?
Yeah, the topic of discussion, the topic of dialogue or shared inquiry, for me would be something like, what would be the most juicy, alive, enabling, fun way to be with rules, and like meaningful way to dance with the topic of rules. Dance with rules in any situation. Sorry.
What's most alive for me is still my previous proposal of making them implicit rules explicit. But with you as the educer, it sounds good to give you total freedom to widen the scope.
Well, just to kind of jump in with you, it's like, as the, let's say, the seed of your proposal, I hear something like you believe in the value, the virtue of making implicit rules explicit, making them transparent. About, yeah, what is the value of that for you? What does that make possible for you?
Right. So I guess that sounds the dialogos already. I propose to you that making rules that may not be explicit, to make them explicit allows everyone present. I suppose this wouldn't work if it was a nation. So I'm gonna pick a group of people that a self-development group of people that decide to meet purely with the intention of interacting with each other verbally in order to improve their self-development for self-growth reasons. So in this context of a Zoom call with approximately 15 people, or in a room, physically 15 people together, my proposal to you is that making whichever rules emerge, making them explicit, allows everyone present to know where they stand and decide whether to conform or not without fearing they've done something wrong. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for setting a specific context. Yeah, like not a nation, not a group of prisoners, 15 people working on self-development in a room or a Zoom room. And then I heard you say that emerge. And so making the rules that emerge explicit. So I'm already hearing in that something of a process of emergence in the group. Like how it is at the beginning is not the same as how it is after a few hours. Something starts to emerge. I'm hearing a connection between making that explicit and actually making it conscious, bringing consciousness to what seems to be in the process of being agreed upon. Or am I getting you? Or
I do feel heard. Thank you, and it's helpful to hear you reflecting back what I've said. So we continue this process. So there would be, for those who are not used to Socratic dialogues, there would be a good degree of repetition, and gradually things may get enriched or may shift. So I propose again to you that in a self-development group of 15 people interacting verbally, even if there are no rules, and often there are no rules in such explicit rules from the outset.
No explicit rule.
Nevertheless, rules would emerge. And my proposal is that making any rules that emerge explicit empowers everyone in the group to feel they know where they stand, therefore they can be free to conform to the rules or to challenge them to different degrees without fear that they are doing something wrong.
Yeah, following your thread, I'm what emerges from what you're saying is that actually making the rules, the emergent rules, explicit, brings consciousness and then enables the possibility of, I can confirm or I can start to challenge. And if I follow that thread, I start to become curious about, okay, what happens if someone decides with this consciousness of, thanks for making the rules explicit. There seems to be a rule here that, for instance, it's not okay to interrupt anybody, but I'm going to start breaking that rule. What would happen then?
Very good example. It's less likely, in my view, that the person would be judged for doing something wrong, because at least they acknowledged that they were conscious about breaking them.
I hear concern in you around being judged and not wanting yourself to experience being judged, and also not wanting that for others.
Yes, for sure. I'm a big fan of René Girard that mentions how groups can easily create a scapegoat. So acknowledging the rules protects anyone to end up being a scapegoat, because there is an acknowledgement, these are the rules, and I can express why I'm challenging them. If the rules are not even mentioned, they could become some sort of they are unspoken and they can just be put on a pedestal.
Yeah, I think I get it. I'm hearing what you say about the danger of unspoken rules. And what I'm picking up in listening to you is the theme of judgment and the fear of what might happen if you break explicit or implicit rules, that the consequence of doing that might be the experience of being judged. And what I'm hearing is that there's something strong or emotional around being judged and wanting to avoid that. Is that an interesting thread to pick up or not?
Yeah. Yes, it is a very interesting thread, and I was putting myself into the position of the viewer, and feeling like this could become really theoretical, where I seem like I'm describing groups where there is stuckness and things are sort of pre-written and pre-packaged. But I feel like with the scapegoating thing, other people would sort of click around certain rules that they like, and they become the ruling of that group, and excluding the person who is the only rebel.
So it's also about inclusion and exclusion.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing behind your words is almost like, if we are clear about the rules and we make them transparent, then it's less likely that someone ends up being scapegoated, being judged, or being excluded. And that is actually the sort of the risk explicit rules would protect us from. So there's something at risk here.
Yes, there's something at risk for sure. And I'm now becoming aware that the total acceptance and the total honesty, they are such fundamental Western values. They can easily, very, very easily be unspoken, and it's quite complicated, complex, and challenging to be somebody in a group of people to say, I feel like we are agreeing on this rule, because the answer could be, of course we are protecting the vulnerable people, of course we are doing total acceptance, of course we are being honest.
Yeah, that's what I meant before, that in that kind of circle of people, it's like almost a resistance against making rules explicit, because we don't need to talk about it. Of course we are really good people who are tolerant and empathic, and and then that's a hidden rule.
Yes, and what I find is that you and I have been part of circling modalities of group work, and in my experience of experiencing different modalities of self-development talking groups, some groups seem to agree on total acceptance as the most important value. Maybe it's not a rule, but it's a value that people hold. And I would put humanistic, Rogerian approaches, person-centered approaches on that end of the spectrum, where you're protecting the vulnerable. And there are circling and other modalities that seem to agree on the honesty part. And I feel like it's almost like these two polarities are almost like the most condensed polarities of Western civilization. They are both so important that some groups think that choosing one would be the most important thing to self-grow, and then other sort of people seem to agree that choosing the other one is going to be the most important. I suppose what I'm trying to say, that even again, and I'm really sorry, even between very self-developed individuals, there is no escaping this issue, implicit rules.
Okay, I'm hearing you say several things that are connected and seeing really interesting connections between them. Because I heard you say something about their very strongly total honesty and total acceptance are both very explicitly Western values. And then I heard you say a little bit later that even people who've maybe done a lot of work on themselves and thought about this a lot, and even those people are not exempt. We cannot escape the tension or the polarity between total acceptance and total honesty.
Yes.
Like I heard you kind of say, like, we have to accept the polarity. We can't choose one and get rid of the other.
I think you're adding an extra valuable thing that's making me think to what I suppose one of the things I was saying is, amongst the people who are most concerned about rules, and I think people who are into group work, I would put them very high in the list of people who think that discussion, honest and supportive discussion amongst human beings, improve their self-development, things can get quite political when you get to that level, as in a sort of left and right. Because I would say that the total acceptance strikes me as being embedded in Christian, but also left-wing values. And the total honesty strikes me also as Christian, but also right-wing politically. So we need to be careful that things don't get overly political when it comes to...
What I'm hearing from your words is you mentioning the risk of polarizing, and I'm not totally sticking with my role of purely educing and amplifying when I say that I'm a bit uncomfortable, or more than a bit uncomfortable, with kind of making two polarities be one, like political left and political right, political left total acceptance, political right total honesty. Like, I get really uncomfortable when you put those two things in the same camp.
I'm hearing you. I suppose what comes up for me is that no matter how much people study and become really erudite and well-read, and you can put people into politics, are very knowledgeable about politics, and also you can put, in my case, I'm not very that's not one of my areas. Self-development is one of my areas. And people who have spent many years, like myself, in the area of therapy and self-development, I feel that there's also a risk of converging on one end of the spectrum.
That's a lot easier for me to just like follow and amplify what you're saying. And like what I'm hearing you say is, we might be highly developed or evolved or have a lot of education, and that doesn't make us exempt from, I think what you were saying is from getting polarized, getting stuck. Yeah. So almost like you're saying, lots of education or work on yourself is not a guarantee that you might not get stuck in unfruitful, unhelpful entanglements. Those are my words, but I don't know if that paraphrases what you were saying in a good way.
Yes, and potentially could be even worse, because if the ultimate destination of my intellectual journey, spiritual journey, is to think that total acceptance is much, much better than total honesty, or whatever else, whatever rules is much, much better than other people's values, that could be very dangerous, because then you end up being self-righteous.
Yeah, so I'm kind of hearing you say, if you don't embrace the polarity of of honesty and acceptance, that they need to be both there, that we kind of need to surf or ride the polarity, and that it's dangerous to choose one side of the polarity over the other. Actually dangerous.
Thank you, Romeck. I feel very heard, and I would like to propose to swap roles.
Yeah, just to give our listeners a bit of context. Thank you, Francesco. In the dialogos process, there's always tendentially one, like that's kind of a form of rules, but maybe an example of rules that enable more than rules that constrain. And that one of us is in the role of proposer, and the other's role is to draw out what that person is trying to say, almost to say what they're almost but not quite saying. Francesco's proposing that I start to propose, and he becomes the educer, the amplifier. I think I just need to give myself permission to kind of take a breath and before starting to get clear about what I'd like to propose after listening to you, Francesco. Like a moment of silence or a moment of not knowing, of aporia. My mind is very active. Suddenly we're skipping over the step of appreciating Francesco's proposing before we go into my proposing. Maybe just wanting to say one sentence about what I really appreciated was your kind of step by step letting something emerge and converge and articulating with every new sentence. Something became more clear about how rules turn up in your life and in groups, and what's important about them. And that then what emerged was an understanding of that rules can't be either advocating for total honesty or advocating for total acceptance, but that these two things are actually a polarity that need to be both included. So that's kind of what emerged from those minutes of your unfolding proposal.
Thank you for your appreciation.
And then I start to think about, or start to feel into, what's still remains mysterious, or what's not being said that I feel drawn to articulate. And I don't want it to be something that I've already thought or said in another context. I want our conversation to be fresh. I think I'm drawn to the aspect of rules as enablers, as maybe another polarity between constraining and enabling, making possible and limiting. Yeah, so maybe my proposal is something in the direction of that rules also need to cover both sides of that polarity of constraining, setting certain limits, and enabling, making possible. The very simple examples I can think of are constraining can be about, well, it's not okay to become abusive. It's not okay to be physically violent. I remember being in one men's group many years ago where the rules were constantly not being spoken and then being almost forcibly imposed. And there was a big controversy about, is it really a rule that we're not allowed to be physically violent to each other? And then two people said, no, bullshit, that's not a rule. And that was for me the moment of leaving the group. And if that limitation is not present, if I'm actually at risk of physical attack, which almost happened in one of those meetings, then I'm not in this group. So that's an example of positive constraining, stopping accidents from happening. You know, like a condom if you don't want to get a baby. Bad example perhaps, but and then the other side is enabling, is because that rule is there, no physical violence, we can relax and we don't have to be afraid. Could be a rule that says, if there are judgments, we want you to own your judgments. To say no judgments, not possible. Everyone has judgments from time to time. To say, so that would be a too constraining role. If we said, in this group, judgments are out, not allowed. Sooner or later, people would have to leave. If we say you have a judgment, it's normal to have a judgment. We want you to own it and see what it says about you. Like possible, that would be an example of a rule that enables. But I'll stop here so you can.
I'm hearing you saying the rules have two main characteristics and qualities: the one of constraining and the one of enabling. You gave two examples. In one, rules as constraining would protect you physically from being attacked.
Keep us safe. Yeah, they're protective, like constraints are protective.
And rules as enabling. I'm gonna need to maybe propose it again.
Well, in a way, you're paraphrasing my words and you're making something shift or move forward, making me think, yeah. So a rule can be both enabling and constraining. And by constraining us from violence, and it enables us to make to feel safe.
Yes, with the same example, the same rule can be both constraining and enabling. In the example you gave, it protects and allows to feel safe.
And now, as you say that, I realize I want to propose something a bit different about rules that builds on what you were saying, but goes in a different direction. And it's something about a situation, whether the rules are, maybe in each situation, there are some explicit and some still implicit rules, but encountering rules, relating to rules, and maybe sometimes experiencing ourselves as automatically submitting or even automatically rebelling, that process is potentially a developmental experience. And having painful experiences with constraining rules and difficult, conflicting experiences around rules also challenge us to grow. And if these challenges of rules that we don't like or rules that we want to impose on others, and the positive and negative experiences we have with them. If we don't have those, so if there's an absence of rules with which we can measure ourselves and experience the conflict, the liberation and the pain of constraint, then we actually can't grow. So that's what I'm seeing about the topic of rules. Like if there are no rules, then we are extremely unsafe. Or if we pretend that there are no rules, we miss a growth opportunity.
I have a question to clarify. It looks like in what you've just said, you were mostly describing the benefits of rules. But in the final part, you also added my point about acknowledging rules, and you also briefly acknowledging the absence of rules, which can be negative. So I feel like you seem to be drawn with this proposal in exploring the benefits of rules more than anything else. So maybe we could spend some time there.
Yes, and it's not so much that I want to speak in favor of rules as rules good, no rules not good, but more the issue of encountering rules and having both painful and positive experiences with them, that's actually a necessity for growth, for inner growth. Our relationship to rules and maybe guidelines or principles, because I would also propose that rules can be more like guidelines or principles to follow rather than iron rules written in stone. That's a different sidetrack, but what I'm mostly wanting to propose is that the experience of rules constraining us and fighting with the rules and having different experiences is a necessity for inner growth.
I'm hearing you saying presence of rules as a constraint creates struggles which are necessary for growth.
Yeah, that's struggling with perhaps both the enabling and the constraining aspects of rules makes growth possible. I can think of several experiences in my life where either I felt extremely constrained by the rules, or I felt threatened by the lack of rules, or I tried to use rules for my own opportunistic reasons or saw others do it. But that whole series of experiences, I can look back and see I needed to have those experiences in order to be a more internally free human being, and maybe even a more loving human being. And
hearing you mentioning the wide spectrum of your experiences with rules, some of them enabling, some of them constraining, some of them explicit, some of them implicit, and all of these struggles seem to be really primary in your self-development, fundamental in your self-development.
Through your invitation to engage in a dialogue about the theme, I start to also see more dimensions of it, and thank you for hearing me with what you just said. And I also feel drawn to somehow bring in a bit more of a kind of global context, just recognizing how the topic of rules turns up in the global theater, like just reflecting on Russia during the communist era, during the USSR era, was, as far as I know, a society with a very, very, very strict set of rules. And somebody broke the rules because of having different opinions, like dissidents, there were extreme punishments. And then Russia is now no longer in the USSR, no longer a communist country since 1989 or since the early 90s. And now it's acting like a country that's breaking all the rules in the international arena. And of course, I'm not saying that other countries are not breaking the rules, but the theme of what are the rules in the international diplomacy and politics, and which rules are explicit in terms of those are the rules that we've all agreed to, and which rules are implicit rules that are being broken, and all the emotional reactions to that. I'm not sure if I'm making if there's much value to my proposal, or if I'm actually making a proposal, but I guess I'm saying it's a very active and alive topic in the global theater.
Romeck, I heard you desire to, well, your impulse at that time, what was alive for you, is to bring the global theater, which for you conjures up ideas of rules. You mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war, which made you reflect of how the same country, over the course of just 40 years, transitioned from being a country which valued rules enforcement as it valued so much about rules enforcement, and then after a few decades that doesn't seem to any longer be at the top of the agenda.
To be honest, I feel slightly embarrassed because there's not much coherence to the proposal I'm making, and I'm very aware of that. I'm imagining listeners sitting there thinking, what is this guy actually saying? You know? I guess I notice in the, let's say, in the discourse in the media, but also among the people that I interact with in different situations, like a kind of feeling outraged about the behavior of Russia and Putin, and that in that sense of outrage, that sense of outrage reflects what happens when there are implicit rules that are being broken. The same kind of outrage I experience in groups, this kind of groups that we talked about, self-development groups. There were implicit rules. We all somehow agreed that there were not really any rules, but suddenly when an implicit rule is being broken, somebody gets very angry, or we all get very angry.
I hear you saying that the public outrage in the media, you seem to imply Western, but it's a question for you, media, can be explained. The outrage in the media can be explained in terms of implicit rules being broken.
It's like if I take that one step further, that idea that we get outraged, we have really strong emotions, or we pretend to be outraged when implicit rules are being broken, kind of means that somehow altogether, without realizing, we've created a situation in which there were implicit rules, and we somehow avoided the making the rules explicit. And if we make the rules explicit, we create a situation where everyone sitting around the table can say, I agree with those rules, I can put my signature under them, I'm committed, I'm part of this group. Or we can say, those rules, I don't agree with them. So rather than thinking about, I'm afraid of being excluded, no, I can choose to be excluded and say, well, those rules I cannot accept, so then I won't stay. So that there's something about that when rules are being made explicit, I can have the choice, that I can really choose to stay within that social context that has agreed on that set of rules, or I can say, I leave because I need a different set of rules in order to thrive.
I hear you mentioning the hypocrisy in the scapegoating process, so judging one party as the wicked, the bad guy, without not making enough efforts in making the rules that the bad guy apparently broke very obvious.
I thank you for bringing out the word hypocrisy, because I didn't actually say that, but it feels important to acknowledge it, that if we have an implicit set of rules and we don't actually make an effort to say, let's look at what these rules are, let's name the elephant in the room, let's make it explicit, then we are creating a situation that is maybe inherently hypocritical or that creates opportunities for hypocrisy, which is the opposite
Absolutely.
of authenticity. And
Yes.
that perhaps reflecting on the global situation by doing at a global level what we often do at a personal, small circle, social level, we create a situation where there are implicit rules. Those implicit rules are getting broken. We get really upset about it. We scapegoat someone rather than acting like adults. So I'm making a proposal about acting like an adult around rules, which is let's take the time to really clarify what are the explicit rules of engagement, the principles or guidelines that we use in our interaction. And then when someone breaks the rules, they can be held accountable in a good way. We can even use that as an opportunity to renew the agreement about the rules or change it. And then the rules are an evolving thing, or the principles. And then we have a situation where if somebody consistently chooses to ignore the rules or the principles and tries to still stay in the group, then we have at least a transparent situation where the person can be held accountable and asked to leave without getting into a drama of that person or that group's being scapegoated.
I hear you saying you don't disagree with the use of the term hypocrisy, and that
no, I do. It's good that I do agree with you mention it.
Yeah, you don't disagree.
No, okay, sorry, I misheard you.
And I hear you saying that making rules explicit also enable us to hold any potential rule breaker, to hold them accountable, and so that that would be a fairer process. You didn't say fairer, but you said adult,
Yeah,
as
more
in
adults.
more adult, no dramas and victim persecutor dynamic.
Exactly. Thank you.
And also giving the opportunity to the potential wicked party to defend themselves.
Yeah. Yes, to defend themselves and challenge rules in a transparent way that can lead to an evolution of rules rather than a discarding of them. And I can't help thinking in this situation of like the EU is a group of states, of nations that claim somehow to be united by a set of values. And that set of values and rules is made partly explicit, partly perhaps not explicit enough, so that when certain nations start to behave in ways that are clearly and obviously not compatible with the set of values that we agreed upon, the EU having, perhaps in this narrative, I'm not saying this is the truth, yeah, but maybe a way of looking at the situation, a perspective, a possible perspective, that the EU as a group of nations have created some kind of not explicit enough rules in which it is possible for someone to break the rules and insist that they have the right to stay in the group.
I hear you giving another example of a situation where the values of the EU, for instance, have only partially been made explicit enough, which allows those that don't respect some of the implicit or explicit values get away with it without accountability.
Yeah, exactly. And like that's a large scale echo of something that could happen at a small scale just as likely in a development group of 15 individuals.
Yes, and I would like to check your time availability and whether you would like to save. So potentially we can do a bit of appreciation, a bit of anticipation. What would you prefer?
I'm happy with either, and I hope this is all still interesting and alive enough for our listeners. I would like to just briefly bring it to a sort of close around my proposal. Just take a minute, Thanks. Well, what I was seeing was like something coming full circle, talking about the bigger global European setting of a group of individuals being not transparent about rules, and then bringing it back to your uh, original context of, let's say, 15 people working on self-development, where we were talking about the polarity, riding the polarity between total honesty and total acceptance, and that we need both. Like if we bring that again into the global EU context, or making that link, like in some settings, somebody could break the rules of empathy and compassion and care about other people in the group, and suddenly using abusive language or acting in shaming or dismissive or contemptuous ways. And then that person could say, well, if they're being held accountable to not being empathic, they could say, well, I'm just being honest, aren't I? I'm just being honest. And so bringing different threads together, I really see the value of taking the time to carefully, compassionately, and with an open mind and an open heart, make a context explicit in how do we engage with each other when things really matter.
Could I ask you to give me, just in order to help me reflecting, to give me a more concise version of your last proposal? Or simply repeat it, please, for me.
Okay, I think I was more trying to sort of summarize the thread I saw through your proposal and mine. The polarity of both sides of the polarity being important, total honesty or authenticity, and total acceptance or radical acceptance, and compassion and empathy. And then I saw that from your thread move into my proposal, which was, I think, well, at least partly to do with even focusing even more on the importance of transparency, that kind of transparency is also a question of acting like adults and not getting lost in drama, and that the more there is that transparency, that rules can evolve, that we can grow from measuring ourselves and social situations and examining and challenging rules, that we need to go through that experience, and that's a necessary form of growth, and that no one can grow to an adult without having been challenged by rules and having had to measure themselves. And that finally, in trying to summarize the whole thing, we come to a sort of how small social situations in groups of 15 people can carry an echo of what is happening on the global stage or the European stage.
There's a lot in there.
Yes.
I feel there's several threads there, so I feel the responsibility of making justice to your sharing. I hear you saying that we've come full circle, starting from a group of 15 people, and then very organically, you're bringing nations, those involved in the recent war, and the EU. I hear your convergence with my previous proposal on making rules explicit, and I heard you describing what happened in the second part of our exploration, where you talked about having adult conversations with no drama, where making rules explicit allow for accountability, allows for a discussion on the existing rules and the possibility to improve them, shape them, change them, develop them. And finally, the small communities can also be affected, influenced by the global affairs.
Let me just say, I didn't mean so much influenced by each other as that they are embedded in each other. They reflect each other. It's like
Yes.
they're fractal. What happens inside can happen in a group, in a small group, can happen in a group of nations also. So it's like a systemic thing.
Yes. I appreciated many things about your proposals. What first comes up for me is your willingness to explore a wide territory, and I could see that you felt you may say something that may be politically incorrect, but nevertheless you venture yourself talking about history and wars and European communities and countries changing and being perhaps inconsistent with themselves. So I appreciated your really not filtering what you were bringing. I also appreciated that you seem to be really touched by my previous, not necessarily influenced, but touched by my previous proposal. So I felt your humility in really embracing another person's ideas. So I appreciated this beautiful mixture of allowing yourself to be touched and enriched by what I bring, and at the same time, you're really exploring with your own your own views.
Thank you. Yeah, and there were several moments where you paraphrased me in a way that brought in, like for instance, that thing about hypocrisy that enabled me to follow a thread more clearly to its construct. And I felt quite awkward at times too, because of this going into unknown territory with each other. And I enjoy just noticing that with you as a friend, as in a kind of emerging friendship, we are discovering that we can do that for each other.
I feel quite touched with you calling me friends, or an emerging friendship, and I feel I reciprocate that. I feel that there's an emerging friendship.
And whoever has been listening, thank you for your patience in listening to our ramblings.
Okay, so we literally want to go for 10 minutes so that we are going to be time boundaried. When you brought the EU and other nations, I felt some sense of resistance because I have my own ideas that the narrative can be so easily manipulated, and we can all be so biased, so easily biased.
Totally.
So at that point, I really felt a sense of appreciation for the self-development groups that I've been part of. And I felt, oh, how comes I've been focusing so much on things going wrong? Because I feel like I was mostly talking about things that may go wrong in groups and even in self-development groups. But actually, when you talked about the global thing, I also felt actually a group of 15 people is much easier, and it's still difficult. But comparing, to find an agreement across 15 people is still challenging, like I was saying. But comparing to deciding whether America or Russia is the wicked party, it's such an easier task. And also deciding the EU values strikes me as way more difficult than a group of 15 people agreeing. And a group of 15 people, I think, is still difficult nevertheless.
Yeah, but to me it seems like when you say that the main difference is not so much how complex or complicated the discussion can get, or how high the emotions can run, because emotions can run really high in groups, but the difference is in what's at stake. Main difference is in what's at stake, how whether lives are at stake, whether finances are at stake, whether economies, whether people's survival is at stake. In personal development groups, I'm not saying that's well, I would say that what's at stake is usually more how do I feel, or how do we all feel, and whether this is contributing to truly contributing to our development or not. But there are no lives at stake. The climate isn't at stake. The collapse of an economy is not at stake.
Yes.
And yet at the much smaller scale, well, in my work and in my personal life, and I hope that I live that with my partner as much as in other contexts, I am very, very passionate about creating settings, carefully crafting, curating, cultivating settings in which people grow in their ability to truly hear each other, really listen to each other, to take each other's perspectives, to not go into a discussion or a drama, but to stay in a dialogue, and not just any dialogue, but a generative dialogue. And I feel very supported by, that even on a global scale, we can talk about the bad stuff, the polarizations, and also and so on, and we can also talk about the counter movements that are emerging, that are evolving, like Otto Scharmer's presencing approach, all the things we learned from therapy, including Rogerian therapy, as well as others, that there's like much more skill, much more competence, much more growth around what does it take to have a conversation, a dialogue in which we all feel heard, and we all feel like we've been truly ourselves and truly honest. So there's space both for radical acceptance and for radical honesty, and that our dialogue leads to something, not just that we are having a nice time and that we feel happy and accepted with each other, but that we can co-create, that we can move towards co-creating a future. So I'm sorry if I'm talking a lot, but that's what I feel very passionate about. So the theme of rules is, for me, a big part of that.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that what's at stake in the global scale is much more. So it is more complex, but it's also much more precious to get it right. There's much more urgency to get it right. And what you were saying at the end, not just have a self-development, airy-fairy conversation, but it seems to be like almost a mixture of the political and the self-development. And it makes me think
yes,
about,
totally.
Yes, it really makes me think, and for me, I've personally come full circle with this, but I'm not sure you, but what many evolutionary biologists believe, that our brain as humans, at least currently, is still very much a 300 people village, is very much based on functioning on 300 individuals, where you know each other. And I think people believe that these days, even you could be part of my 300 people, but we don't have enough bandwidth. We don't have enough capacity, emotionally, physically, time-wise, to have more than 300 people in our life. And out of those 300, obviously, 20 would be friends. The other ones would be just colleagues, acquaintances, the different degrees of intimacy. But what I'm thinking is that I know in Portugal you're not the only person from all around the world that moved there. I know that there's one very interesting kind of hippie community of people coming together that will go under the 300 people, having a mixture of the 15 people self-development, but also they need to bring some of the political into that, because we're gonna cultivate the farm together. We're gonna grow seeds and plants together. And also, how about sexual, and are we gonna date each other within this community?
Exactly. And how are we going to deal with conflict, and what are we going to do if we disagree on what we're going to plant? So it's what happens on that small scale reflects what happens on a big scale. And again, what we've been practicing here, Francesco, not so much in the content of what we're talking about, but in the process of how we talk about it, which also reflects certain rules, is for me about learning to expand my capacity to really hear you, and that both of us were practicing expanding that capacity without and while holding back from saying yes, but I think, and learning from each other's perspectives. And I feel that incredibly important capacity to develop. My relationship with my partner has become much better through it. And on a global scale, we need to develop that capacity, or we'll end up polarizations that we create end up leading to more war and disaster.
That's so true. In the first part, you were really focusing on hearing me and making me feel heard by reflecting back. And then I was doing my best to do that by hearing you and reflecting back what I was hearing. And we didn't do it 100% today as planned, but I guess that's also because we don't know each other and the topic in question so well to do it in a complete dialogos. But maybe if we meet again, we can agree to be very much dialogos format interaction.
I find that an interesting experiment, yeah. Because and I want to say I'm learning that form and that format, and I found myself stumbling and taking risks and feeling embarrassed at times. But I'm glad that we spent the time learning this thing that feels important.
Thank you so much for your time and
You too.
participation. Thank you for joining me, Romeck, and see you soon.
Yeah, thank you. So